All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's Another Power. So I wanted to make a video about another forgotten bodybuilder. So this is going to be a bodybuilder from the UK. His name was Frank Richards. So Frank Richards was a bodybuilder from the 1970s, and he really hung around with that whole crew of bodybuilders from the 70s. You got Arnold, you've got Albert Beckles, Franco Colombo, Frank Zane. So all those guys out in Venice Beach, those classic California bodybuilders from the 70s. He hung around with all those guys, but he was a little bit lesser known than they were because he was based in the UK. So he wasn't as big over here. He wasn't as well known over here, but he was a big deal in the 1970s bodybuilding scene. And he's definitely worthy of a video in terms of being a forgotten bodybuilder. So honestly, he had a pretty unbelievable career. So his very first bodybuilding competition was the NABBA Mr. Universe in 1967. And his final bodybuilding competition would be the 1998 Melbourne Grand Prix, where he would place 7th. So a 31-year competitive career in bodybuilding, and he was still placing in the top 10 after those 31 years. So very, very impressive. Now, the sad thing about Frank Richards is the fact that he is such a forgotten bodybuilder. There is not a whole lot of pictures out him. Trust me, I scoured the internet looking for pictures from his 1998 show, and I could not find a single one. So there's really not a whole lot of pictures out there, not a whole lot of information out there either. But he was a pretty memorable bodybuilder from the 1970s. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at his competitive career. So some of his best wins include the 1970 NABBA Mr. Universe, which he won. And then fast forward 15 years to the 1985 Mr. Olympia. So this was a little bit of an interesting circumstance here. He was invited to pose at the 1985 Mr. Olympia, but it was more intended to be like a exhibition type, almost a guest posing, but really he did the unexpected and ended up being top 10 at that Olympia. So he really kind of came out of nowhere and impressed a lot of people that year, battling it out with some of the best on the Olympia stage in 1985, including Bob Paris, Rich Gaspari, and Tom Platz. And he was 40 years old at that Olympia. Now, 1986, following the 1985 Mr. Olympia, was a pretty good year for Frank Richards, but following that year, his placings would steadily go downhill. At the 1987 Night of Champions, he did not place. And then up until 1989, he had a lot of placings outside of the top 6. Then from 1989, he would take an 8-year hiatus, and he would not compete again until the 1997 Arnold Classic, where he would place 12th. Then his final competition would be the 1998 Melbourne Grand Prix. As I mentioned before, he placed 7th at that show. So in the 70s, he spent a lot of time living with Arnold. He worked with Joe Weider, so he was definitely a main focus point of that bodybuilding scene. But when these names come up from the 1970s, you typically don't hear anybody talk about Frank Richards. So I definitely wanted to make a video about him because typically you'll think of the Lou Ferrignos, you'll think of the Franco Colombos, you'll think of the Arnold Schwarzeneggers. But when do you ever hear anyone say, oh, you remember Frank Richards? So he was a great bodybuilder. From the few pictures that you can find of him from back in the day, you can tell he had crazy conditioning. So his conditioning was definitely one of his key advantages in some of these shows. There is a posing video you can find of him posing at the 1985 Olympia where he looks pretty good. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of stuff out there about Frank Richards and not a whole lot of pictures either. So Frank Richards is still alive today, and he spends most of his time teaching seminars on bodybuilding. He apparently derives a lot of satisfaction from kind of helping the younger generation of bodybuilders that share a similar interest to him, helping them get ahead. So that's the story of Frank Richards, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.